So I'm now going to refer to a production of The Tempest that I made a couple of years ago. So I'll be really clear at the outset and say I'm not going to suggest I found all the answers. I'm not now going to smugly virtue signal them all to you. I just want to use this production as a way of sharing examples of my imperfect attempts to wrestle with that conundrum in practice. Some things on the show we did really well, others could have been better. I can assure you we did a full post-show evaluation, which I won't be boring you with now. What I'll just do is offer some examples of the way in which the show attempted to speak to both historical and contemporary environmental concerns and to platform as well as enact in the very DNA of how we made it environmental justice. And following UN and IPCC definitions, I'm understanding this as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental decision making, especially historically or currently marginalised communities who have been or are disproportionately affected by climate breakdown. So the production was in the Royal Shakespeare Theatre at the RSC, and it was made almost entirely out of reused and recycled materials. Narratively, it amplified environmental themes that are in the play. It drew out the elements in the story that show people in a survival situation at the mercy of an unpredictable environment. This island was polluted, there was rubbish everywhere, and our Prospero and Miranda were a mother and daughter attempting to eke out an existence on this destroyed and impoverished piece of land. This toxic place was kind of gradually cleared during the action of the play through encounters which I'll describe shortly, until at the very end, with the possibility of reconciliation on the horizon, a greener world was revealed, suggesting the possibility of societal, personal, and environmental repair. So I'll talk about the ways in which we kind of built this show in three different ways. Preparation. We began prep for the show about 18 months before rehearsal started. This was to allow time for meaningful engagement with local and international civic organisations whose work is connected to some of the environmental concerns of the play. So through consultation with them, we worked their experiences and thoughts into the show, and then they had ongoing involvement with it as we rehearsed it. And I'll say more about those groups in a moment. My next P is personnel. So the majority of humans involved in the show, whether they were backstage or on it, were women, and the majority of people were from the global majority. Diverse lived experiences, including visible and invisible disabilities, as well as representation from different nationalities, ethnicities, language speakers, class backgrounds, and heritages was present amongst us. A founding principle of the production actually was that if we were going to try and truly speak to the global climate crisis, we needed a company that would draw on individual and collective understandings to notice things in the play and suggest things for the production that would speak to those varied and specific experiences. And in terms of casting, The Tempest, of course, has got a very long and fantastic history of being staged in very specific contexts to expose uncomfortable histories and uncomfortable presence, especially in regard to abuses of power and racism and inequality. So my production sought to find a way to speak to this, but also complicate it environmentally. We didn't want to simply other Caliban, for example, or just have one actor in the company from the global majority. What felt important for this show was to try and represent the multiplicity of human experiences in the face of the rising seas. So we interrogated the play's dual instigating ideas, the wreck of the British ship, the Sea Venture, on an early colonising expedition in 1609, and the severe flooding of the River Severn across the southwest in the Midlands of England in 1607. And we also wrestled with the nominal Mediterranean setting of the story itself, with that stretch of water's current and very terrible role in the journey of climate refugees from Middle East and Africa. So amongst the play's vast geographic reach, there's this useful eco-dramaturgical complication that comes very early on from that gesture, that line spoken by the boatswain in the opening scene when the boatswain says, "What care these roarers for the name of king?" The suggestion somehow is that humans are socially levelled in the face of the rising seas. But of course, in environmental justice terms, that levelling is not equitable in terms of either culpability or experience. So we found that a very useful provocation and explored that idea in a multitude of ways. And so each company member choose to draw on what kind of aspects of their own experiences and understandings they might like to draw attention to as part of their characterization. And by doing so, then shed light on some of the injustices inherent in the text in Shakespeare's world then, and of course in ours today. So our Caliban, for example, was Tommy Siman. Tommy's a British Iraqi actor, and he chose to play the character drawing on his own heritage from the Swana region in conversation with Caliban's backstory. So that backstory, if you remember, involves an Algerian mother arriving on an island, which is somewhere between Tunis and Naples. Maybe it's somewhere like Levanzo or Ustica, one of the many uninhabited Mediterranean islands which are used today by climate and conflict migrants who are attempting to cross that stretch of water in light of conflicts which are, of course, caused in no small part by Western resource wars. So we worked with Iraqi and Algerian scholars to understand backstories of characters in this region, and we placed Sycorax's backstory appropriately within Tommy's own sphere of reference. To make that geopolitical narrative legible, our Caliban didn't just speak English in the play, but he also spoke Darija and Takbaylit, which are two languages of Algeria, and he code switched between the two. And at the end of the play, when he took possession of the island, Tommy spoke those languages as well as speaking in one of his own languages, Arabic, to call out, "This island is mine." That's an example of how the individual experiences of the humans in the room were drawn into meaningful conversation with Shakespeare's characters through the prism of modern environmental and political struggles. My next P is practice. So we decided very little about the show before rehearsals began. The designer and I just settled on a floor and some basic structure pieces that we found from stores. And obviously, I acknowledge here the privilege of working for a company that has extensive stores. So there was no traditional model box, design process, and there was no kind of set build. So we pulled loads of stuff that we could reuse from previous shows, including some we'd made together. Other people donated stuff to us, so we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then we just packed it all into a rehearsal room. So the creation of the show came from playful and improvised interactions by the actors with this pile of stuff. So the actors created the entire world of the play. And our puppetry director, for example, would watch how they were interacting with objects and figure out what things might be able to become. And our movement director looked at how the rubbish might be given meaning through the dynamics of bodies in space. Our composer invented instruments made out of junk. Our lighting designer adapted old kit. And it kind of started to become clear that some things would be really useful and could be really sort of carry iconic and thematic significance. The oil barrel, for example, a rope, that bag, and others sort of didn't. And that kind of meant that overall, the entire company, as well as all the community groups we engaged with that I mentioned earlier, were all very active in building every single moment of the show as a collective, then obviously steered and curated by me. So that is sort of one way in which the company's globally representative experiences and responses to the climate crisis were embedded in the entire narrative. So we've had those three Ps of preparation and personnel and practice. And of course, it's an artificial separation and they begin to completely intersect. So I'll just kind of let them. And I'll talk now a little bit more about the community groups that we work with, because it's through those that intersection becomes most apparent. The three main local ones we work with were a forestry organisation, a collective of schools, and a volunteer litter picking group called Rubbish Friends. So to start with the forestry organisation, they supplied all the organic matter for the production. And on their advice, we used coppiced trees to form our beautiful green world reveal at the end. We planned the timeline of the show around their natural woodland management cycle, which also included how and when the timber would be returned to them after the show had finished, where it could become natural hedging and deer hurdles and things like that. That organisation that we work with helped manage that woodland that I was standing in earlier. The local schools engaged various different age groups over a school year in conversation with the existing syllabus to explore the themes of the play. And they ended up making lots of bits of kind of props and set dressing for the show, including, you might be able to see here, some kind of Miranda's like childhood pictures and art and crafty sort of objects. They made that all from kind of waste materials that they found in their local schools. They also made front of house displays, amplifying some of the themes of the play, and they also made various creations for the actors to have backstage in their dressing rooms as well. The volunteer litter picking community group Rubbish Friends shared the fruits of their litter picking endeavours with us, including flotsam and jetsam that they pull from the River Avon. And our stage management team literally sifted through all of those items, and we used many of them in the show. Members of the group were empowered, so sometimes they would find something particularly interesting or that they felt was particularly representative of a certain climate story, and we would then try and find a way to use it. I'm not trying to claim that these relationships were entirely acts of co-creation, but it was certainly a big attempt at equitable creative climate activism, where we could engage people who were meaningfully engaged in the show's creation, especially some of those working on the front line of alleviating some of the local issues, alongside young people who were, of course, most impacted by a climate-inflected future. So in this way, the show literally helped clear up the town, as well as empowered those organisations who then all came into rehearsals and continued to offer ideas and engage with the production. So that's the hyper-local version of it. How could we reach out and engage the global community? On a national level, we partnered with some UK beach cleaning organisations, and we removed more toxic waste from the UK's beaches, which we then repurposed into the show. And on a global level, we consulted with a number of NGOs who operate worldwide. For example, this women's climate group who spoke to us about the reality of female vulnerability in climate inflected areas, which sort of follows UN research that women are most likely to be negatively impacted by the crisis. We were also in touch with the Recycled Orchestra of Capoeira in Paraguay, who helped us learn how to make junk instruments instruments out of junk materials. Our live band then kind of invented these sort of materials. So this is a drum that was made from an old plastic tub, and they were all played live on stage, as well as this futijara, which is a kind of flute made from a drain pipe and a bit of plastic tubing that Ariel played throughout the show. So rubbish is, of course, a sort of useful shorthand, a universal shorthand for any kind of environmental damage. We used it to signal various thematic concerns through the way that different characters interacted with it during the play. So we had a human from the privileged classes, Ferdinand, clearing it up. So his task, rather than just kind of carrying logs around, which is, as Randall Martin and others have pointed out, another deforestation reference, of course. His task in this show was to untangle plastic and rubbish from that wood and to litter pick, and he genuinely litter picked from the audience during the show as well. We also use rubbish in sort of terrifying, startling ways to reveal its awful power. Like the dogs, remember that plastic tub you saw one of the actors, Tina Chang, playing with earlier? So those, through our work with our puppetry director, Rachel Channing, turned into these kinds of dogs here, which were lit with wind-up torches, with the actors holding them through their heads. So it was really clear in our production that Prospero had been cast away from Milan because of her greedy capitalist brother and his cronies, and that it was those people who were literally and metaphorically the ones most culpable for the damage. So during the show, Ariel and her spirits manipulated all the rubbish to create the set-piece theatrical moments of the play, like the Harpy, where the baddies are confronted with their evil and they're asked to reckon with their misdemeanors. So our Harpy was formed largely from black plastic bin bags, and Ariel was standing on the oil drum. And as the baddies went to eat the food at the banquet, oil appeared to spill from their mouths, and they pulled fishing net plastic out of their throats. So this was an example of how we tried to connect everyday plastic to the global issue of ocean pollution, and to make the scaled leap, of course, between plastic and big oil. After the rubbish had gone and been used, the spirits took it away. The idea being that as the more than human world was using it to confront those people who'd done the damage, that when they gradually began to learn the error of their ways, so the rubbish could gradually get removed. Because we wanted to echo the literal work that community groups like Rubbish Friends and the Recycled Orchestra of Capoeira do, showing the genuine potential for progressive change. Our goddesses were elemental spirits, and they represented earth, sky, and water, and their clothing again made of litter that was shed as they gradually were able to bless Miranda and Ferdinand's union. And when Prospero herself saw the potential for change, and she realised the culpability of her generation, as well as her own personal infliction of harms, and pondered the future that her child might inherit, she delivered the Cloudcat Palaces speech as a moment of clarity, a kind of vision of the destruction that has been done to the earth, and an image of the dismantling of those temples to humankind's hubris. As I said, of course, this production wasn't perfect. We had last-minute buys for shoes. We pulled lots of power for our sound. We definitely could have been more specific about some of our thematic amplifications. And I think we also could have communicated better with the audience. In preview, I overheard someone say at the interval, haven't they made that rubbish look real? And I sort of realised with horror that an audience member thought that the RSC had painstakingly recreated rubbish, that our brilliant props department had done that. So I think in future, I fully intend to have biographies of stuff in the show, in the programme, not just the company's credits. But I feel like we should sort of list all of the previous lives the materials have had, and then we'll go on to have. But I guess in a way, that kind of imperfection, like the very fragile and hard-won sense of hope in the play, is sort of the point. You know, nothing about alleviating climate breakdown or working in that field is easy. Holding the space for difficult conversations, bringing people together, attending to historical injustices, laying the groundwork for future cooperation, all of it involves missteps and wrong turns and painful moments. I think it's probably only through that kind of learning that we can become match fit for what is to come. So the show ended with an imperfect but eco-hopeful vision of interpersonal and environmental healing. And I think it's not inconceivable that it can have a real world impact. The headline in one paper, rather than reviewing the show, reviewed the change it contributed to. I mean, small steps, right? Uh, By the way, here comes the plug. If this sort of thinking about how productions might engage with environmental justice in both material and metaphorical ways interests you, there's more on these ideas and others in this book that I've recently had the pleasure to co-author with Katie Brokaw called Performing Shakespeare on an Endangered Planet. So it's got more stuff about my show as well as loads of other people's shows, and including Katie's brilliant show, brilliant production of Dream in Yosemite National Park, which you'll be hearing more about later. So to finish then, I'm learning that changing the way that theatre is rehearsed and made is as crucial as the story that is told on stage. Addressing environmental justice begins with who is in the room, who is empowered to make meaningful contributions, whose story is told, how does that manifest to the audience? It takes into account the material impact of the production, and it connects eco dots between people, places, and things. And I think the real impact is made when story and methodology work together. So when a play that already has Shakespeare's environmental awareness encoded so deeply within it, like The Tempest, is then attended to and decoded and recoded in such a way that connects his reality to that of today. And within that process, there are, of course, all kinds of contradictions and messy complications, just like that sycamore grove that both is and isn't on the western side of Verona, and that both is and isn't a site of solace and one of damage. I think I'm learning that what matters seem most is that first act of paying attention and using that information to attempt to lever some kind of positive change. So this show was just a step towards climate conscious theatre making, where the work surrounding the production, the before, the after, the rehearsals, the onstage and the off, all came together to platform and enact the possibility of repair. Thank you, and have a very wonderful 24 hours.